Chapter 2. A development most mysterious. The next morning arrived like an unwelcome house guest carrying too much luggage. Detective Raven Darkblade hadn't slept well, which was his default state since the incident he never talked about but thought about constantly. His apartment smelled of stale coffee and unfulfilled dreams, with a hint of Chinese takeout from 3 days ago. The phone rang with its shrill cry for attention. Raven knocked over 2 empty beer bottles reaching for it, adding to his collection of things to clean up later but probably wouldn't. "Darkblade," he growled into the receiver, his voice rough like sandpaper that had been left out in the rain. "Mr. Darkblade." "Jane Scarlet." Mystique's voice trembled like a leaf in a hurricane that was actually just a strong breeze. "You have to come quickly. Something terrible has happened." Raven sat up straighter, immediately regretting it as his back reminded him he wasn't 25 anymore. "What's wrong, Miss Mystique?" "There's been another death. My husband's business partner, Richard Worthington. He's dead in my living room." This case was getting more complicated than a jigsaw puzzle made of spaghetti. Raven threw on yesterday's clothes, which made them today's clothes, and headed for his car. The drive to the Mystique estate took 30 minutes through morning traffic that moved like molasses, going uphill in winter. The city of Shadowport looked grey and depressing, which was actually an improvement from its usual state of grey and very depressing. Jane met him at the door, her face pale as moonlight reflected off a ghost. She was wearing a black dress that made her look like an expensive funeral, which was appropriate given the circumstances. "He's in there," she whispered loudly, pointing toward the living room with a trembling hand that belonged to her. "I found him this morning when I came down for breakfast." "Who has breakfast at 11 a.m.? Raven entered the living room, which was decorated in what interior designers would call nouveau riche nightmare. There, sprawled on a Persian rug that was probably worth more than Raven's car, lay Richard Worthington. He was definitely dead, which Raven could tell because of his years of experience looking at dead people, and also because of the knife sticking out of his back. "Did you touch anything?" Raven asked, pulling on latex gloves he'd remembered to bring this time. "No." "Well, yes. I checked his pulse, and I may have accidentally knocked over that vase, and I moved his hand because it was pointing at me, and that seemed rude." Raven sighed deeply, like a balloon giving up on life. "Please don't touch anything else." A new figure appeared in the doorway, Bob the butler, looking nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. His uniform was impeccable, unlike his alibi, which didn't exist yet. "Begging your pardon, sir," Bob said, in an accent that couldn't decide if it was British or Australian. "But I heard a commotion last night around 2 a.m. Sounded like an argument." "An argument?" Raven's eyebrows did that thing where one goes up and the other stays put. "Between whom?" "I couldn't say for certain, sir. But one voice was definitely Mr. Worthington's. He has had a very distinctive wheeze." Jane gasped dramatically, clutching her pearls which she wasn't wearing. Richard did wheeze, ever since his skiing accident in Aspen. Or was it Vale? One of those places where rich people break their legs expensively. Raven examined the body with the thoroughness of someone who had watched a lot of crime shows. Richard Worthington had been a large man who looked like he enjoyed his steaks rare and his whiskey neat. The knife in his back was ornate, with a handle that screamed, "I'm expensive and impractical." "This knife," Raven said, standing up with his knees creaking like old floorboards. "Have you seen it before?" Jane peered at it, careful not to get too close because death might be contagious. Oh my God. That's from Sebastian's collection. He collected ornate knives and butterflies and those little spoons from different cities. The plot was thickening like gravy left on the stove too long. Raven pulled out his notepad, which was actually just a napkin from Denny's, and started making notes. "Tell me about Richard Worthington," he said, his pen poised like a tiny sword ready for battle. "He was Sebastian's business partner in the butterfly importing business," Jane explained, wringing her hands in a way that would make Lady Macbeth proud. They'd been friends since college, Harvard, or Yale. One of those schools that looks good on a LinkedIn profile. And their business relationship? Rocky, like the mountains. Or the movie franchise. They argued constantly about everything. Money, butterflies, whether pineapple belongs on pizza. "And where do you stand on the pineapple issue?" Raven asked, because sometimes the important questions needed asking. "I'm pro-pineapple," Jane admitted shamefully. Raven made a note. "Suspect has questionable taste." The butler, Bob, cleared his throat in that way butlers do when they have something important to say, but don't want to seem presumptuous. "If I may, sir, Mr. Worthington received a phone call yesterday evening. He seemed quite agitated afterward. Used language that would make a sailor blush and then apologize to his mother." "Do you know who called?" The caller ID said M. Chambers. Mr. Worthington kept saying, "You can't do this, M." Rather dramatically, if I may say so. M? The same initial from the butterfly letter. Raven felt like he was onto something, which usually meant he was actually nowhere near something. "I need to see your husband's knife collection," Raven announced, with the authority of someone who had no actual authority. Jane led him to Sebastian's study, which looked like what would happen if a library had a baby with a museum, and that baby had expensive taste. The knife collection was displayed in a glass case that was supposed to be locked, but wasn't. "One's missing," Jane observed, her detective skills rivaling those of someone who could count. Indeed, there was an empty spot in the display, like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. The little placard read, "Malaysian ceremonial dagger, 18th century, probably cursed." "Probably cursed?" Raven asked. "Sebastian had a sense of humor," Jane said sadly. "Had. Past tense. God, I'm a widow. Do I need to wear black all the time now? Because black really isn't my color. I'm more of an autumn." Raven was about to respond when they heard a crash from the living room. They rushed back to find Bob standing over the broken vase Jane had mentioned earlier, looking guilty as a dog next to an empty pizza box. "Terribly sorry," Bob stammered. "I was trying to clean and butterfingers." But Raven noticed something Bob hadn't. Among the broken pottery were several butterfly wings. Beautiful, iridescent, and definitely not native to Shadowport. Well, 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 Raven said, because saying well 3 times was traditional in these situations. It seems our murders might be more connected than we thought. Jane fainted, but gracefully, like a Victorian lady who'd practiced. Bob caught her with reflexes that seemed too good for a butler. And Raven stared at those butterfly wings and wondered if this case was going to be the one that finally made him quit and become an accountant, like his mother wanted. To be continued. Author's note for Chapter 2. This chapter is dedicated to my other pet goldfish, Lady Pemberton, who is actually Sir Reginald in disguise. I apologize for nothing and everything simultaneously.